Magic is found in every room where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah, and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset, and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance. Hey, welcome to the Magic in the Room. I'm Luke Freeman.
I'm Hannah Bratterud.
And I'm Chris Province. How are you guys doing today?
Doing great. How are you, Chris?
Good to see you guys. It's a sunny day here in Oklahoma. It's nice. It's like maybe 50 degrees, but sunny. So probably my favorite kind of day. And it's Luke's 40th birthday. So this is a birthday podcast episode. So congratulations, Luke. What's reflecting on the past 40 years? What are you going to do when you grow up?
Oh, man. I wish I knew. I will say I read this quote. Well, I didn't read this quote. I was watching a show and last night with my boys, and it's a show about what would life look like on an alien planet? Like, what are maybe some types of life that would have evolved based on what we know about how life works on our planet? And so, it was talking through these creatures, and one of the statements that they made, like, what we've learned on Earth is that when the unexpected happens, when a meteor hits, when there's climate change, when whatever, the generalists do really well and the specialists get wiped out. And so in the show, they had this whole thing about a meteor hitting one of these planets, and the specialized creatures that had adapted to the conditions on that planet, a lot of them were gone, but then like the little small mammals or the crocodilians, basically the living garbage cans that can eat whatever is around, right? They're the ones that made it through. And scientists think that's what happened on our planet too, with the last big meteor strike that really led to like rat-like and mouse-like creatures, these mammals really surviving and thriving as they went through. So all of that to say, I am glad I'm a generalist in the 2020, 2021 era that we live in. I'm glad that I'm interested in a lot of different things and that I can flex. And the fact that I'm a generalist and that I can kind of dabble in HR and in organization design and in strategic planning and in leadership training and in coaching, like all of those things, there's definitely some themes and threads there, but I could see myself being really excited about a lot of those things and wherever opportunity presents itself. Brand architecture, brand purpose, clearly, is something I'm passionate about. So that makes me feel excited about the next 40 years to see which of those things will kind of emerge as the place where I can help people the most and provide the most value. So that's kind of my 40-year-old reflection. I'm glad I'm not stuck with like knowing one technical really well, or I think I'd be way more scared with all the change that's happening.
Sure. No, that's awesome. Well, welcome to 40. Welcome to the club. We were joking earlier that our team is rapidly approaching being all middle-aged. So welcome to the club. It's great to be here. I think we're going to pick up a topic today around managing conflict. And let's start, we'll hit it with a question, and give me a time or an example of maybe when you saw a leader like really take something that could have been really contentious and create an environment where it could be really worked through in a productive way. What's something that you guys have experienced where that's happened?
I can start because, since we have Luke here in the room, I have to say that Luke is one of those leaders that has the ability to do that. And, I think we're gonna talk about some tactics today on how to do it. But personally, I'm learning that from Luke and from some of our conversations, and just even with our team of 3 here of, how we are learning about how to build greater trust, and that trust is something that needs to be constantly reinforced, that it's not something that you have once and then, it's something we have to continually build on, and some of that vulnerability. So, I've watched Luke, facilitate in a room. We call this podcast The Magic in the Room, because you can get people together in a room and get issues on the table in a healthy way. And so I've watched in client rooms, where we bring people together and are able to voice difficult things that people are sometimes afraid of voicing, because they don't trust themselves and how they're going to come across, if they're going to get too emotional or act in a way that they're not proud of, or they're afraid of how someone else is going to respond. And so, yeah, I would say some of the techniques that we're going to talk about today, when I've watched, Luke facilitate meetings using those, it's amazing the level of connection that can happen when we bond over things, and I do a lot of sales training, and overcoming objections is a very common challenge for most salespeople. How do I overcome objections? And that is an area that can feel contentious, or there's some conflict there, right? But if you use a process that focuses on listening and really empathizing with the other person's viewpoint, you can build a bond rather than create contention. And so I think that's, for me, is the key to be able to flip it. Some vulnerability that can help us connect on a deeper level.
Yeah, well, I mean, thank you, Hannah. There's definitely some kind words in there. I aspire to actually live out, some of the ways you described me. So I'll kind of take it and operationalize it. How do I see people creating healthy spaces and safe spaces for conflict? And I'm going to use a really concrete example. So just the other day, a client that we were working with, they had put in a bid for a big project. It would be a big deal. They would be able to grow as a result of winning this bid. And they submitted this bid in a kind of non-traditional fashion. They said, hey, let's try something. We think it's a really progressive, organization that we're presenting this bid to. This was in a B2B context. And so let's create this really cool, kind of flashy, out of the box way that we're going to respond. And just heard back, so that they worked really hard on it for 6 weeks, getting all the information together and creating this new way to do it. And then now here we are, a couple months later, and that organization's making decisions on who they're selecting. And they replied back and said, well, actually, we didn't even consider you because you submitted all this work in a way that wasn't really inside the box of what we were looking for. And so that, they said, hey, well, we'd love to just send you a PDF if that's what you want. And they're like, nope, time's window is closed. Like, this is it. Thanks, but no thanks. Don't call us, we'll call you. Very, very much closed door response. And so, I was working with the leadership team, and they were thinking through, well, what do we do with this? And one of their takeaways was, let's bring this to our entire team and say, hey, want to update everyone. Lots of people worked hard on this bid. It was a failure. And this is how we approach failure at the firm, is we want to talk about it. We want to have healthy feedback about it. And that's not necessarily directly around conflict, but I think actions like that, behaviors like that, transparency like that, approach to things not always going our way, it does set the stage to say failure is normal. And in relationships, conflict, which some people view as a failure, is really normal. And when it happens, let's not, avoid it at all costs. Let's not talk about it. Let's not sweep it under the rug or put it in the closet or whatever. Let's really pull it out and spread it out on the table in front of us and say, hey, how would we do this differently next time? And what can we learn from this? And I think for leaders who think about failure that way, they also are a step closer to thinking about conflict that way. And you can have a blow up, and then a couple days or a week later come back and say, hey, we had a blow up. And that happens sometimes. We're people, right? Let's talk about that blow up and what can we learn from it? And does it show us our values in a more clear way? And how do we, in a way that's aligned with our purpose, move forward and navigate this conflict? So some kind of operational thoughts and some communication thoughts on conflict and failure.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of calls to me a couple of things listening to you guys talk is this idea of like, what is our primary source of conflict? Like unmet expectations, period, end of story. Like that's the source. Okay. And embracing the source, I think, can take some of the emotion out of dealing with it and out of managing the conflict. So I wanted to call that out. Like primary source of conflict is unmet expectations. So that's why we have an obligation to get alignment. The other thing that I was thinking about as you guys responded is how there's almost this sense of recovery that if we are in a situation where your performance or behaviors don't match with what I expect, when I can come to see your perspective or you can see my perspective and we ultimately get expectations aligned with behavior, there's this affinity that transcends that moment. And we talk about in like guest service situations, when you have a service breakdown, when you can go win back that relationship with recovery, that customer is more satisfied than had they received straightforward delivery because of that I guess discretionary commitment to the relationship. And I think that's where my head's at. There's this element of, rather than let conflict fester and boil and just lay under that sheet of ice, right? It's that discretionary commitment to the relationship that's exhibited when we come around the table and emerge the conversation. How we emerge it is a whole other conversation or topic, but getting to the table, who is showing the commitment to that relationship. So source of conflict, thinking about this idea of recovery and how that relationship can grow as a result of commitment and be better, transcending the moment. And then, this third idea of how trust and conflict dance together. And when we are going to sit down and have, healthy conflict or engage in conflict, the emotional state that I bring to the table and my perspective of the other person, like how that matters. Do I come to the table out of a place of care and respect and wanting this person to succeed? Or do I come to the table with an expectation of they serve me and I'm going to succeed, hell or high water? It shows up differently. And so as we engage in that conflict, we are going to get what we give in that regard. So those are kind of my three takeaways: is how trust and conflict dance together, and what I bring to the table emotionally will be fed back. The idea of recovery and how that creates more commitment as we go forward. And then the source of all conflict being unmet expectations. So with that, I think we got a nice high level of what it is. I don't think we have to explain what conflict is. Everyone experiences plenty. So let's just break this thing down. Let's say, okay, let's make this a more tactical conversation and make it about managing conflict. If you're managing conflict, Luke, what's the most important thing you feel like you can do?
Yeah, so I think it's all about trust. And oftentimes if someone goes in and maybe they recognize that there's conflict happening, especially if they're a tactical focused person, right, and an outcomes focused person, it's very easy to go into it and say, the goal for this conversation, the way that we're going to get the outcomes that we want is if we figure out who does what by when and get some sort of agreement on that, right? And if we go into it and just start talking about, well, we disagreed about this the other day, so we're at a bottleneck, so we need to figure out what we're actually going to do and move forward together, like it really doesn't speak to the root issue of why maybe you had a blow up or a conflict in the first place. And to do that, you really do have to circle back and say trust, and specifically trust that's built on moments of vulnerability, like trusting who the person is and that they have your best interests at heart, and that you share a vision for what success for your organization looks like. How are we going to fulfill our purpose together? Like trust is it. It's the key to navigating that conflict. And Chris, as you were talking about unmet expectations, like all that is, I mean, that's a trust exercise to get that on the table. Like, can you think of something more vulnerable than to say, well, what I was expecting out of this relationship, out of our collaboration together was X, and what you delivered was Y, and the experience I got, was different. Like that's a very vulnerable thing to say. It's admitting that maybe you had the wrong assumptions about why we're all here together doing this thing, or maybe it's actually saying the other person's in the wrong, which if I believe that, that's a vulnerable thing for me to say. So, even voicing that, my expectation was this, what we actually delivered was this other thing. That's a trust exercise in itself that people need to lean into before they try and get tactical and start talking about what are our outcomes.
Yeah, and I think there are a few critical intersections where being intentional about building trust is important, right? And so, first of all, in the relationship itself, like from the beginning, get expectations on the table and try to, whether we're going into a meeting or we're going to an event or we have certain projects that we're working on, whatever it is, get expectations on the table early on, right? And we've talked about balancing stakeholders and, bringing people together and making sure that everybody's heard. And part of that is bringing forward expectations so that we're clear on what the expectations are. But sometimes we have expectations that we're not even aware of until we're in a conflict situation and we see that, but I thought this would happen, right? We didn't realize until we had an unmet expectation that we actually had an expectation about it. So being intentional about building trust at the onset and at every stage in the relationship, but also in the conflict, when the conflict arises, being able to create that environment where people feel safe to be vulnerable. And then the third critical intersection is also the repair of the relationship after there's been a conflict that may have gotten contentious or emotions, feelings were hurt. How quickly do we repair the relationship afterwards? And this is true in personal relationships and in business and professional relationships. Conflict is going to happen. We are going to have reactions. Reactions will happen. That's natural and normal. And we're going to get emotional sometimes. What can really help to repair the trust in the relationship is, shortening that time to repair whatever needs to be repaired. Because every time there's a conflict, there's a little tear, right? And if those tears get bigger and bigger and we don't repair them, there's weakening of that relationship. It's a little bit like a muscle fiber. You exercise it, it actually breaks down. It's during the repair that the muscle actually gets stronger. So I think in order to really build and bolster trust, circling back and repairing any sort of lingering, emotional scars that may have happened, I think is important as well.
Yeah, there's so many threads to pull with that. I mean, one example or situation that came up as you were talking in my mind was, a common conflict, which is someone hears something in a meeting for the first time and decisions get made and they think they should have been read in on it first. And I think, like, what's the root issue of that? Is it's a lack of role clarity or unmet expectations on what someone's maybe power is on a team, or what their role is on a team. And to be able to follow up on that and say, hey, I thought that we had a relationship where I needed to approve this idea. I think there's some big flaws in it before it got out to the team. Like, as a leader, that's a super vulnerable thing to go and say, like, I'm pulling my boss card, on the one hand. On the other hand, for the other person to say, hey, I hear you saying that, but you said last week that we were a collaborative team and that we all should bring our best ideas to the table. So that's what I did. And I prepared for this and came and presented. And you could have told me your issues with it in the meeting with everyone else. That's a super vulnerable thing to say too. And so, yeah, I mean, just this idea of not of time to repair and having a conversation that's that difficult within 24, 48 hours, like, that's a big ask for people. I'm a little intimidated, Hannah. That's a big ask for people, but we're also talking to people that I think want to be in the top 10% of organizations and leaders. And, like, this is the kind of hard stuff that's asked of us if we want to be in that high echelon.
Yeah, and just, it makes me think about the role of mindfulness in all of this and how mindful we have to be as leaders to not, like, I have to want to listen and listen and listen and not get caught up in the emotions that someone's perspective elicits in me. And, like, that's hard. Like, that, it's just when you're just biting your tongue, wanting to respond, wanting to cut the other person off because their perspective is so far off base and out of alignment with our intent, but to continue to ask questions and listen. And I want to kind of stomp that idea with everyone. Listen, and when you feel like you can't listen anymore, ask another question. And that's the discipline of a leader. People say, well, the ethereal thought of, like, being mindful. No, like, tactically listen. Don't talk. Just listen and ask more questions and ask another question and fully understand that person's perspective. And you'll feel yourself kind of come down as you continue to go down that path with this person, because everyone wants to do well at their job. Now I've got to challenge my own assumptions. I've got to say, maybe this, I'm seeing now that I did not make my expectations clear, that I had another assumption from a different conversation. And of course, I see how we're misaligned. But in order to get there, we have to be mindful enough to shut up.
Man, I mean, yeah, no one wakes up and says, I want to be the biggest asshole in the room today. And we forget that, except for Chris sometimes. We forget that in our day-to-day life when we find ourselves in conflict with someone that is really rubbing us the wrong way. And, I'm going to push this and make it really uncomfortable because organizations across the country are dealing with this right now. But diversity, equity, inclusion, how politicized that's become, but how critical it's become to valuation of companies, to be frank, and also how important it could be to the experience of folks inside the organization. I see people all the time doing this dance where they're pretending to listen to the other side and actually say, well, I think I understand where they're coming from, but not doing what you just described, Chris, which is sit down and listen and listen and listen. And, like, you start to feel like this is so inefficient. We're going around and around and around. But my challenge is, until you've gone around and around and around enough times that you actually understand their perspective. And you're like, oh, they're not evil. I see where they're coming from with this. Okay, like I disagree, right? I think they have a wrong assumption. I think, we have some differences here in our values, whatever. Like, yeah, that stuff's still going to exist. But until for that individual we have compassion, like we haven't gone around and around enough yet. And the problem that I'm seeing with organizations that we're working with is they're going around and around like 2 times when it needs to be 10. And they think for the sake of efficiency and marking things off the list and getting things done, they're going to go ahead and move forward and go down the road. But they're going to find themselves 5 years from now with these root issue things still coming back, still plaguing. Like they're going to have this Achilles heel that they never actually dealt with on the front end.
Well, and this all goes back to something we talk a lot about here, and it's how we create employee experiences, how we do guest service, but it goes back to the most basic human need, which is to feel seen and heard and to be valued and, to be understood. But that need to be seen and heard, that is arguably the most fundamental human need, even before food and shelter and physical needs. The social need for being noticed is critical to our survival. And a human infant cannot survive if someone doesn't care enough to pay attention when they cry. And so, because we're so hardwired to be dependent on another human being from birth to take care of us and meet our needs, that need never goes away. We have to be noticed by another human in order to survive. And that's encoded in our brains. So we see it in children. When they don't feel seen or heard, they make noise, right? They throw a tantrum. We see it in adults. When they don't feel seen or heard, they act out in some way or they shut down. That's another protest behavior, right? Of, I don't want to play. Nobody's paying attention anyway, so I'm going to take my ball and go home. Those are symptoms that someone isn't feeling like they're being heard or seen or noticed. And I think as leaders, the most important thing we can do is to listen and pay attention and give voice. And so we see it in children and adults. We see it in sales. We see it in guest service. We see it in employee experience. And we see it across our country, right? We see when any group of people feel like they're not being heard, they're going to make noise until they're heard. And that's often where a lot of conflict comes from. So I think that point, Chris and Luke, about listening and have we really heard what someone is saying, or are we hearing what we think we're hearing? Or are we hearing what they are actually trying to express?
Yeah, and I think it really scratches at we can talk about how it's just big systems fail to hear everyone, whether we talk about governance or organizations. So that's why it really creates ownership on independent leaders within those systems to listen to all the voices, right? And understand the different perspectives and give value to the different perspectives. And I think that's, if I'm talking about, if I'm a state representative and I'm not listening to all my constituents, but I am a loud voice for some of my constituents, right? And that's the only message that people hear. Then those other ones know they're not being heard, or they don't feel heard when my partner and I have an argument. If I don't at least say, I understand how you would feel that way, or I value your emotion, I value what you feel, it doesn't necessarily mean I have to agree about the circumstances that are creating that. So at least it's saying, I see you, even if how you got where you're at and how I got to where I'm at are different things. And it's about having the mindfulness to say, here's my read on the situation. It is different than yours, but I'm not saying it's any more valuable than yours. The idea is how do we look at this situation and work from it in a way that's more aligned, or figure out a different answer. Like, somebody can let it go. That's always an option. One of us has got to let it go. We got to find aligned behavior, or we can go separate ways or whatever. But no one can really exist as a doormat. Right? I think that's now when I'm talking about being the one experiencing conflict. I want to kind of take this perspective for a moment. If I feel this discourse, if I have conflict, I have unmet expectations. I've got really what I think are two choices. I'd be interested in your guys' feedback on this. I think I have to let it go or emerge a conversation. And by let it go doesn't mean eat the sandwich. It means let it go. It doesn't mean bury it and continue to build resentment and allow my performance to be constrained by resentment. Let it go means let it go. Like, I'm not going to worry about that anymore. So, how do you balance, like, I don't want to be a doormat. I don't want to let everyone just do whatever because I have a mindful perspective on things, or I have a willingness to let more go than most people. So how do we navigate all that when we're the one experiencing the conflict?
Yeah. Well, the science around this is really interesting. You can think about conflict on a couple different continuums. One is level of cooperativeness. So you can be uncooperative or highly cooperative. And another would be assertiveness. Are you unassertive or are you assertive in how you want to deal with this conflict? And if you map all the different styles of conflict on those two axes and those two continuums, you end up with 5 different styles. So I'm just going to run through them really quickly. So highly assertive, but low in cooperativeness is competing. High cooperativeness, low assertiveness is accommodating. Right in the middle on both of those is compromise, right? So I'm a little bit assertive, I'm a little bit cooperative, right? We can compromise. If I'm low in both, I'm unassertive and I'm uncooperative, I just avoid conflict altogether. And if I'm highly assertive and highly cooperative, it's collaboration is our approach and our style to conflict. So oftentimes when people hear kind of these 5 different styles, competing, collaborating, compromising, avoiding, or accommodating, it's easy to say, well, collaborating, right? High. That's what we ought to aim for. But the uncomfortable truth is, like, that's not the best answer all the time. And it's situational what style we need to adopt. And just like everything else in life, so I'll use an easy one, introvert versus extrovert, right? I have a preference of how I'm going to behave. I'm typically an introvert, but for me to mature and be intentional about my behavior and how I show up in this world and how I impact other people, I have to learn to be intentional and say, in this setting, I'm putting on the extrovert hat. I'm going to bring energy to this room, this conversation, this experience, whatever else, right? In the same way, I have a preference in my style. For me, my preference is to collaborate. I love finding win-wins and, like, digging into conflict. And maybe some of that feedback that Hannah gave earlier is probably a reflection of that. But where I get in trouble is when I need to compete and I am unable to let go of the other person's, like, what a win for them is. And so if I'm interlocked in a conflict with someone who has values that don't align with mine, I will collaborate and collaborate and collaborate myself to death. And they will suck all of my attempt to create win-wins out of me and just totally use me for ends that do not align with my values. And so I have to learn, like, what are the times that, like, I got to compete and say, I'm going to beat you because I don't agree with your beliefs about the world, right? So that's just a quick run through of those styles of conflict. There's an assessment around that, Thomas Kilmann instrument, we love doing sessions with teams around identifying what their styles are and then talking through how do we get intentional about using the right style at the right time. But just wanted to share a little bit of that science.
Man, and that's such a interesting point, Luke. Understand, like in organizational context, though, and this, I say it all the time. I love doing this because I learn, and um, you know, being trying to be collaborative when we should be accommodating, like that's an issue. Competing when we should be accommodating is an even bigger issue because effectively we are burning like personal capital or political capital within an organization. So we have to really know where our relationship stands with the people we're having conflict with, because if we go competing and they expect accommodation, the fuse is lit, right? And it can harm our organizational position. So my kind of test for that, like, am I willing to compete? I immediately go to, is this worth burning political capital and my positioning? Like, am I likely to win? Right? If I haven't, and then even if I do win, I'm probably going to create some element of suffering. Is there a benefit? And does the benefit outweigh the suffering? So those are kind of my thoughts or methods on when do I decide to compete. The benefit has to outweigh the suffering I'm about to create. And it also has to overcome any cost, any political capital that I would incur in getting that win.
Yeah. And I think those are, I think, really important points to think about, right? And whether it's entering into conflict or bidding on a sales opportunity or an RFP, right? They're competitive situations. When does it pay off to compete? And another question that I like to ask is it worth my energy? Because every time we enter a competitive situation, it requires energy. And I better make sure that that energy I'm going to spend on this is worth the outcome, or is that energy better served somewhere else? So I find myself sometimes, if I'm in a contentious situation where I feel like I'm getting into this competitive situation with someone, I have to take a step back and assess, is this really worth my energy? What is my level of caring in this situation worth the energy that I'm putting into it? Or should I maybe adjust my expectation and recognize that this is not an area I need to be competing in?
Yeah. And that's, as someone like as independents where we might work for, any of us work for six or seven companies at a time, right? Where we're independent, we got to keep in mind, like, it's important for people to get the wins and not battle, like not compete on everything, but ask the question and listen. And, for the people listening, we do a lot of work in gaming and hospitality, but people only go to casinos because they win sometimes. And if nobody ever won, nobody would ever go. And the same thing with people engaging with me. If I never allowed people to win, there would be no reason for them to engage with me. It'd be like they reported to me or something I don't want, an existence that I don't want to have. I want to be collaborating, compete only when it hits those measurements I talked about earlier, and then accommodate when then you can tell when someone is attached to something. Like, I'm not burning political capital on that stuff. Figure out what else needs to be top of the list. Like, very rarely do the things people are emotionally attached to rise to the level of have to be at the top of the list. That's something I've learned over time. Like, just let it be. It may not be exactly like you want it, but it's their thing. Let people have their things.
Yeah, I will say, like, I'm going to push back on that a little bit. This is where strategy is important. And we can't only be around the relationships and building healthy teams. We also have to have sound strategies and direction. Growing up kind of in the church world and in nonprofits, you see accommodating happen a lot And essentially over time, when you accommodate too much, you dilute your strategy because resources are spread out across 20 different strategies or pet projects because you couldn't tell anyone no. Like any church you've ever gone to, like this is just what they do. Like, oh, hey, Joe wants to start this thing. Let's let him do it. And he's got his 5 buddies and they're going to do this car wash ministry, or whatever. And then you've got 20 of those things going on. Well, like, what does this organization actually do except accommodate and not align? And so I think we have to be mindful of that. But Chris, to your point, if we're only on the other side and saying, well, we've got 3 strategic initiatives here and your idea doesn't fit in any of them, so it's a bad idea. Like, no, you can't spend 10% of your time on that, right? That doesn't work either. We're going to lose all of our best, most creative people.
Yeah. I think, as I walk away from here today, I walk away with a little bit of an idea of I probably need to know my personal process, right? Do I tend to be more accommodating or do I tend to be more assertive? What is my natural wiring? And then how do I show up for that other person? I walk away knowing to listen and like really be dedicated to listening. And I walk away knowing like it really rides along with trust and that I have to bring to the table like an honest emotion about how I feel for someone. And it has to come from a place of care and respect if we're going to have healthy conflict. And this idea of like being in service to other people sure helps, if I expect to have healthy conflict. So those are kind of my takeaways for today and hopefully things that I'll get better at as we walk forward and continue our journey. But what are you guys' thoughts? What are you walking away from today with?
I mean, for me, it always comes back to, we've talked about it. We'll talk about it some more, and we'll keep talking about it. It is trust. I think that is the crux of this whole thing, because when I trust you enough to, and I'm going back to like basic human psychology, that you're not going to abandon me, you're not going to leave me, you're not going to hurt me because I'm expressing a need or I'm expressing an expectation. Or if you do any of those things for a moment, you're going to come back and you're going to repair that. I'm going to feel that I'm going to trust you because I know where you're going to, that I know you're going to be there for me. And I use you in a general sense, but that's the experience I have with both of you as business partners and teammates. And I do think that that's a really important, concept in building and maintaining trust in a way that we can tolerate conflict in relationships.
Yeah, that's good. And I think my takeaway is really similar. It's around being intentional around trust. And I just kind of want to end with this tip. It's a little trick I have for conflict. Sometimes I think about conflict, especially if I'm going into a meeting or a conversation, is like this balloon that's filled so tightly and I'm coming into this with a needle and I'm like, this is going to be ugly. It's going to be loud. It's not going to be good. But have you guys seen the trick where you like turn the balloon kind of on end and at the very tip of it, there's this area of the rubber or latex or whatever that's not stretched quite as tight. And if you take the needle and poke it like carefully through that very tip, like it'll make a little hole, the balloon won't pop and the air can kind of slowly leak out. I think about this trick kind of like that. And it's just basically to state your fear about the conflict and your overarching intent for why you're going to wade into it anyway at the beginning to set the table. So I don't know, some people are watching this on YouTube, some are listening to the podcast. Hannah has these really beautiful earrings on right now. But let's just pretend that I hated them and I thought they were unprofessional for our podcast, right? I wouldn't want to approach it and say like, Hannah, I don't think those are the right earrings for today. Like, please go find something else to wear, right? That would probably pop the balloon, right? We would have some cleanup to do to pick up all the pieces later, right? But if I came into it and said, man, I've got some feedback and I have a perspective. I'm not sure how to communicate this. I just want you to know, Hannah, like, I'm nervous to have this conversation with you because more than anything else, like, I value our relationship and I don't want to hurt you because I care about you. But I also really care about Magic in the Room. And I want us to like have this brand and come across a certain way. So I feel like I might hurt you, but I also feel like for the good of all of us, I want to share this. And it's about your earrings, and then go on with the conversation. So,
and by then I'll be like, oh, that's all it is. You
right.
like some big thing.
But this idea, like, oftentimes we feel like we can't say, I'm nervous to have this conversation. I'm scared of how this might impact you because I care about you. And if we just say that at the beginning, oftentimes it's a safety valve that allows us to build trust, like we've been talking about, and have the conflict. And it can be a win-win and move us forward as a team. So
awesome. Thank you, guys. Luke, that's powerful. I love that idea of like find a way, show vulnerability, and let the air out of the balloon versus having the explosion. And I witness you do that a lot. And I admire how you handle conflict. And so for me, I just have to intervene on myself, right? I think being mindful of how I respond is really critical. But I know that I walk away from today a little bit better at it. Thank you guys for plugging in, and thank you for everything on Magic in the Room. And for anyone listening, we'd love to talk about how conflict influences teams and conflict processes, figuring out maybe where your team's at relative to their thoughts and how they engage in this particular scenario. So give us a holler, connect with us on our social channels, hit us with a message here, however you'd like to get a hold of us. We are ready and available. So until next time on Magic in the Room, thank you guys. Have a good day. Talk soon.